Chapter 7, AEROGREEN. I believe that I got inspired to create the name of this chapter and place from the band Aerosmith, who was a brand new band when I was writing this. And now AEROGREEN and Aerosmith reminds me of Aragorn. But here we go. We're going to go on. As though the heavens reacted on cue, the sky soon filled with heavy gray clouds as the afternoon came on, and just as evening arrived, the air cooled, the wind rose, and it began to rain. Disheartened and uncomfortable, the troop of 6 marched on without conversation, hoping to put as many miles behind them as possible, before bedding down for the night. Gabriel was in the lead, pressing them to a brisk pace, even with his stiff leg. Then came Day and Percy, then Pythagoras, Freygood, and finally following up at the end of the column, Commander Benjamin Binder. The drizzle was constant, and at times it came down in bitter, soaking torrents. The crumbling road wound over gray, featureless hills and through dark, shadowed valleys, but it remained true toward the eastern mists. Day turned his face from the sharp sting of the rain, using the back of Gabriel's pack as a visual focal point. It was a tiresome march, on and on, cold and dreary. The rain made a constant ambient drone on the rocks, grass, and leaves all around them, spattering in deepening puddles, tapping relentlessly on their packs and soaking everything that they carried. New streams arose, flowing down freshly eroded gullies on the hillsides and across their path, swathing them in ankle-deep mires of deep-sucking mud that tugged at their weary feet. The shapes and silhouettes of the hills and trees were dreamlike in the twilight mists, gray and ghostly. Over their shoulders, the 2 Gharnian scout ships cruised silently behind, as if secured to tow lines. Low above the treetops, unconcerned that their presence was now known, nothing could be seen beyond their dark windows. But one thing was for certain: the Gharnians were warmer and drier than the marching troop. The suns never showed, so night came quickly. Just as day began stumbling over roots and stones in the dark, Gabriel suggested that they find a place to make camp. They closed in together under a cluster of trees up against a short stone wall, but it was neither dry nor warm there. For nearly an hour, they constructed a lean-to of limbs and pine branches to help shield out the wind and rain, roofing it with large, flat poplar leaves, layered one over the other like flimsy tiles, and fresh pine boughs on top of that for insulation. Dreher got a roaring fire going near the wall, and they ate a wet dinner, but nothing they did could warm or cheer them. Gabriel and Dreher blamed themselves for the mishap with the creeper, and Binder, perhaps in the worst spirits of all, felt inclined to blame them both. The wind whirled over and around them throughout the long night, sometimes able to reach into their tiny space and pass through their wet garments like cold, ghostly hands. Although all were exhausted, most could not sleep, so the posting of a rotating guard was done, but was never necessary. Day spent the night sitting up, shivering, pressed between Freygood and Prince Gabriel for body warmth. His waterproof cloak could only do so much. The persistent rain still found ample access through the flimsy roof of leaves, dripping down into his collar, leaves, and boot tops. He found that if he closed his eyes and pictured his homeland Mead with its daisy-dappled meadows and fountains and crystal palaces, for brief moments he could dismiss the ugly weather and occasionally ignore the jagged little rock that pressed against his spine, no matter which way he spun. However, these moments were few and far too brief. Whenever he opened his eyes and peered out into the gloom, the dark shapes of the Gharnian scout ships were always vaguely discernible in the distant trees of the south, small red lights blinking like the blinking eyes of the cattle wolves. Eventually, somewhat of a dawn did break. and at once they were up and moving to get circulation back into their chilled, stiff limbs. They ate breakfast on the move, only a handful of dried fruit, dried meat, and wet bread for each of them, except for the carnivorous Thorian, Ott, who had only the strips of meat, and he ate them ravenously. The bothersome rain came and went all day. Sometimes the clouds separated to display a vivid blue sky beyond, fringed in rainbow colors where the sun's light grays passed, but then, like dark curtains, the walls of rain and clouds closed it all out again. The trail was swampy and thick with muck. Dark mud clung heavily to their boots and pant legs. There was a lot of quiet mumbling and cursing. Day often thought of Devlin and wished that he were there guiding them. He believed that things would have turned out very differently had the wizard been there with them the day before on the Creeper's Hill. They stopped frequently to rest. Feet were sore, wet, and blistered. Skin was chapped and irritated from the friction of wet clothes. Everything in the packs was soaked through, and this made them heavy and burdensome to carry. Ott's fur was tangled, lumpy, and flattened, but oddly enough, he didn't seem to mind. Outside of Percy, Ott was perhaps one member of the troop who complained the least about the rain. Before the sun set that next night, outdoorsman Dreher optimistically predicted the coming of a dry night and the morning ahead of them, and the others concurred. The signs were clear. Red in the morning, travelers take warning. Red at night, travelers delight. Usually that old saying held true. The nurturing rains had more than done their job there, cleaning the air, feeding the trees, and refreshing the earth. And now the custodial rain clouds had moved on elsewhere to continue their work. Spirits began to rise. The troop found a clearing among the circle of ancient pines, and before dark they warmed themselves against a raging fire that could be seen for miles. No wood was spared. The wet logs steamed, hissed, popped, and whistled before eventually drying out and catching a blaze. Then they turned through the firewood cycle from full-on red golden glory to piles of blackened ash and smoldering coals, hotter than any oven, perfect for the stew of pork and onions and wild tubers and pine nuts Dreher was busily preparing for them. Clothes and blankets were hung to dry in the tree branches and small A-frames made of sticks they had set up near the roaring blaze. The food was soggy, but the tea and the wine were perfect. The crew took time to pull burrs from stockings, mend cuts and scratches, and check each other over for wood ticks and leeches. The feeling of warmth was a welcome reprieve, and a reason for occasional laughter and song. Dreher brought out a mandolin and serenaded them until they began to nod off. After a full belly and a draught of wine, Day could not hold his eyes open a minute longer. His clothes and sleeping blanket were warm and wonderfully dry, laid upon a thick bed of moss and dry pine boughs, only yards away from the glow of throbbing orange coals. Above the treetops, 1,000 diamond-like stars twisted and twinkled as if they were on display exclusively for the weary campers. Day dreamed of Deadland Dane. The wizard, oddly enough, was made out of smoke in his dream, a dark, swirling mass of thick gray smoke. Day could smell him, too, although it wasn't until the next morning that he would realize that it was probably the smell of a spark that had burned a small hole in his pillow that had inspired that illusion. Devlin was in a small, dark room that was filled from floor to ceiling with books. He was searching for something, frustrated and anxious. He pulled the books from the shelves with both hands. They were turned to ash before hitting the floor with the explosion of dust. Day was looking in as if from a thick glass window, and he cried out to him, but no sound came from his mouth. He tried and tried, but was unable to reach the old man. The Deadland of smoke was encased within a thick glass sphere upon an old cluttered table within a dark, forgotten room. within a dark, forgotten castle thousands of miles away and hundreds of years ago. All right, next part. 3 more days passed in a similar manner, the troop marching diligently during the day and resting as best they could, much more comfortably thanks to the kindlier weather, through the cool nights. They had left the knotted grassy knolls of the creeper land far behind them. There were clusters of woods before them now as the hills steadily rose and fell, and they passed many lakes and ponds full of cattails and lily pads, swollen full from the recent rains. The courses of what might have been millions of hidden tree frogs was often overbearing. Fording flattened streams was a common but necessary nuisance for the traveling party, keeping them soggy from the knees down. When day awoke the next morning, Gabriel was sitting close to the fire with a curious smile upon his face. Dreher and I had already finished packing and were busily cleaning up their camp. They seemed ready to depart. The suns were warm and the skies were clear and bright. The morning air was brisk and refreshing to the palate, and small gray moths fluttered in the nearby trees. Day was instantly famished. "Good morning," Gabriel said, bringing Day his breakfast. "Hope you slept well." "Like a proverbial log," he answered, brushing leaves from his hair and his fingertips. "The best since we lost the ship." "Good. Ready for another day of it?" Day pulled his blanket aside and reached for his boots, feeling inside each of them to see if they had dried sufficiently next to the fire. "I do believe I can go on," he said with a small degree of humor and forced enthusiasm. "It would be nice to have a carriage about now, though, drawn by sturdy horses, if you could arrange it. Or at least have my breakfast served to me in a warm, dry parlor somewhere away from these moths." Just then, Binder and Percy came jogging into view from the distant trees on the far rise. They crossed the hollow and came jogging up the hill through a narrow fissure between the rocks, looking tired and apprehensive. The rest of the troop paused as if waiting news from them. "We lost him," Binder replied between labored breaths when he had drawn near. "About 4 miles to the south." "Lost who?" Day asked. Apparently, he had missed something that morning as he slept. "The Usurapi was just too swift," Binder continued. "We didn't have a chance in hell of following them by foot. But the good news is that it drew the smaller Garnian sledge ship away, maybe for good," Percy added. "But to what purpose we don't know. Their motives remain unclear. I do not believe they were friendly to one another." "What? What have I missed?" Day stammered. "Apparently quite a lot." You are a deep sleeper when you do sleep, that is for certain," Gabriel answered. "I'm awake now." Gabriel found his seat next to him, tightening his bootlaces. "Just a bit of harmless excitement is all. Last night, while most everyone was asleep, we had a visitor of sorts," he said. "I was still on watch. It was as pitch as tar. Percy and I were stoking the fire in a final time for the night when we heard a strange noise coming from the other side of this very hill, from around that stand of beech trees on that exposed ridge right up there," he said, pointing. It was a shrill animal cry of distress, like some large predatory raptor. The smaller Garnian scout ship immediately turned aside to investigate. We thought it best to wake Binder to stand guard while we went to see what it was as well. We followed the tree line over the shoulder of the hilltop, staying near or under the overhanging thickets wherever we could. In the pale light, we did indeed discover a large bird up there, a large, full-grown Usurapi, saddled and bridled, but at the time riderless, and it appeared to be embattled with something that we were at first unable to discern in the darkness. The bird was quite evidently struggling and fighting with some dire foe by the desperate cries it was making, crashing through the underbrush and stirring up clouds of dead leaves and dirt. We crept in on hands and knees as near as we were able. Its right leg was stuck, or trapped in something, judging by the way it was, hopping about in circles, like it was caught in a hunter's trap. It flapped its featherless wings ferociously and pecked vehemently at whatever it was that held it. We slid in a bit closer on our bellies, and as our eyes finally adjusted to the night's blackness, we could finally see the flightless bird's adversary. Coiled and twisted at his feet was a huge black and white striped Singolius dragon snake. Its jaws were clamped right upon the great bird's foot, and it was attempting to pull it back into its cave to devour. A what? Day asked. A Singolius, Gabriel repeated. It's a large, multi-horned snake, changes colors. A rare legless dragon of some ancient origin, a constrictor, ambush predator. The Usurapi and Singolius were engaged in mortal combat. Quite the spectacle to behold. I wish to have seen it, Day declared. Oh, it was over before we knew it, Gabriel said. As we squatted there in the brush, a man suddenly emerged from the brush on the opposite side of the veil. The Usurapi rider himself, silver war sword unsheathed and flashing. He was a large, strange-looking man dressed in violet and gold stripes, with a strange helmet and armor. He struck at the Singolius with incredible speed and dexterity, and within moments, the dragon was dead. Binder joined us there and advised us that the second Garnian scout ship was also gone missing. Fearing for our safety, he had come looking for us. So we watched the rider check his steed over, soothing it in his strange tongue, and then he mounted it, looking continuously over his shoulder into the trees above his head. It was then that we saw our two Garnian scout ships hovering silently there above him. The rider goaded his steed, and in a flash, they fled down the slope in the opposite direction into the shadows and were instantly gone. Curious. Who was he, I wondered, Day asked. Well, what kind of a man was he? What was he doing out here? Does it in any way involve us or our mission, do you think? It all remains a mystery. It was an odd-looking fellow for sure, with a strange helmet fixtures and tubes connected to cylindrical packs on his shoulder harness. We tried to follow him, Binder added, but he left us in his dust, and the trail grew cold. A mature Usurapi can cross territory impossible by men on foot. In its speed, they can often outrace a horse. Dreher curiously added, it was strange that the Garnians would take such an interest in this lone Usurapi rider. They forsook us to pursue him. When we saw the larger of the two scout ships circle back toward our camp, we turned aside and headed back, Percy said. I have never even heard of a Usurapi, Day said, flabbergasted, or a Singolius dragon snake. They sound terrifying. Well, there are many strange and fantastical creatures throughout this kingdom, that is for sure. Both these creatures are infamous. I once witnessed a flock of wild Usurapi destroy an entire mining village, Dreher Freygood went on to say. And not all in one night. I was but a young man still, in my first year of flight school, and we were camped in a cave on a hillside near Fugel, near the river Meese. Down below us was a strip mining village, mostly Gytho, but a fair number of Tiberlians made their home there as well. The Usurapi flock, a whole flock, came charging in one night unexpectedly like a stampede. It's said that traditionally they're scavengers by nature, carrion eaters, but these birds were not scavenging anything. They were vicious hunters and killers. They went for the easy targets too, children, small women, livestock, and pets. For 3 nights in a row, this went on, always around twilight. The miners made a stand the best as they could. No one stayed the 4th night. And I once saw a Singolius swallow a man whole, Gabriel interjected. In the Singolius' defense, This particular man deserved his fate. I'd rather face a nest of Singolius, Ott said, waving at two small gray moths that fluttered around his face, than one of these pesky moths' infernal insects. They tortured me all night, fluttering in and out of my nose and my ears while I tried to sleep. Well, if we're on the road that I believe we are, Dreher forewarned, shoveling dirt onto the dead campfire, I can tell you, we'll be seeing a lot more of them before we see less of them. All right, we'll cut it off right there for part 1. We'll divide this chapter part 1 and part 2. So that's AEROGREEN part 1. We'll get to AEROGREEN part 2 tomorrow.